Hey guys, today I want to talk about how I made my latest custom Super Mario Bros. Wonder level, which is called Pyre Pump Pit. Unlike my last couple of levels, I decided to try to make this one using exclusively vanilla objects and enemies. So I decided to use burners, moving blocks, and pump platforms because I knew for a fact that I could make some fun setups using these mechanics because I'd previously made a new Super Luigi U level with a similar set of gimmicks. As for enemies, I decided to use Mumsies, which fit the level's theme, and Paracoopas, which have a nice interaction with pump platforms. So now let's have a look at how the level design process went. Let's start this time-lapse off by talking about something a bit unusual, which is this level's name. Pyre Pump Pit is kind of strange as far as level names go because, well, why is the word pyre there? Sure, it's a vaguely fire-related word, which makes sense because this level uses burners, but a pyre is specifically the thing you burn bodies with as a part of a funeral ceremony. And surely that doesn't have anything to do with this level, right? Well, it does actually, because remember, the level also uses mumsies, and although mummification and cremation are two separate funeral practices, they do both sort of relate to my idea of this level basically being a crypt. Of course, I doubt most people will realize or care about that, but either way, it was a fun thing for me to think about whilst working on this level. What's unique in a way about the fact that I decided to use these big moving stone blocks throughout this level is that these are also the main gimmick of one of the levels that uses this underground temple theme in the original game. I usually try to avoid blatantly reusing a combination of mechanics and theming in this way, but it just made too much sense in the case of this level. And I suppose by extension the same thing also goes for the mumsy enemies, which were also used in this theme in the original game. The way the blocks are used in this beginning section is also very similar to how they're used in the original game, where they're activated by a Wonder Bud and move once before stopping in place. However, what the original game didn't take advantage of is the fact that these blocks can also move back and forth perpetually, so I relied on this throughout the majority of my level. In general, this level is basically one big highlight reel of most of the cool stuff you can do with Super Mario Bros. Wonder's moving objects. There's blocks, semi-solids, burners, platforms, and coins all attached to different types of rails, all moving in unique ways throughout the level. And even then, there's still loads more that can be done with this kind of stuff. For example, in this level, I barely took advantage of the fact that burners can be rotated. Leaving something like that on the table means I can potentially use burners again in a future level, and to then focus on their ability to rotate. Having said that, in some ways, burners are actually way more limited in this game than they were in New Super Mario Bros. U, for example. For some reason, Wonder doesn't give you any control over how long the burner takes to turn off and on again. You can either make them turned on permanently or switch back and forth at a preset speed. In New Super Mario Bros. U, you can tell the game exactly how many frames each burner should be active for, which allows for some extremely cool setups in custom levels like the World 7 Castle of Cloudy Super Mario Bros. U 2. At least the movement of burners can be controlled freely in Wonder, which sort of makes up for their lack of flexibility in other ways. Although actually, you know how in the original game, sometimes moving blocks like the ones in this level do a little shaking animation before they start moving? Well, for some reason burners don't match that animation when you attach them to the blocks, which looks really odd, so that's why I disabled this animation for the blocks in my level. The first purple 10 coin is hidden on the other side of this elaborate setup with a staircase of moving blocks that the player is normally supposed to climb. Because of how this setup works, it has to move pretty slowly, meaning the player may have to wait quite a while before they can potentially collect the 10 coin. This is one of the many side effects of the fact that this level relies on multiple cycle-based mechanics, the moving blocks and the burners, of which the timing is completely arbitrary and unrelated to one another, basically. So there's a burner that turns on and off right before the moving block setup for the first purple 10 coin, and depending on the pace at which you've loaded the level, these can line up in completely random ways. Because of the aforementioned lack of control Wonder allows over burners, there's basically nothing I can do about this, but for the most part I don't really think this is a big deal. It just means that this level occasionally expects the player to wait around for a couple of seconds, which can be frustrating. However, this is also what made me decide on this level's Wonder effect, though we'll get to that later. It is kind of funny how the fact that this level uses pump platforms and burners means it could have made more sense as a factory or even an airship level, as opposed to this toxic ruins theme. However, I just made a factory badge challenge level, and I've also already previously made an airship one, and like I mentioned earlier, I do like mixing and matching different level themes and mechanics. The slightly annoying thing about using these specific toxic ruin style moving blocks in this level is the way their visuals work. So as you've probably noticed, these blocks have this cool glowing animation whenever they move around, that stops once they've reached their destination. This is because, unlike a lot of other moving objects in the game, these blocks attach to rails directly, allowing the actor to change depending on the state of the rail they're attached to. The problem with this is that in order for the block to properly display the cool glowing graphics, it has to be attached to its own rail. So normally in a setup like this, where there's a bunch of blocks all moving in a synchronized pattern, all the blocks that move in the exact same way could be hooked up to one rail. But I instead had to set up an individual rail for each block, because else they wouldn't glow properly. I could have technically probably made a duplicate of the actor that just glows by default, and then used that in sections like this, but I guess I was too lazy to do that, or maybe I wasn't lazy enough, whatever. The semi-solids that move along with the blocks were a completely incidental part of this level's set of mechanics, by the way. They're the same semi-solids that the original game used for the big swaying sections in the Shoomp level, and they just happen to fit in perfectly with these moving stone blocks as well. I suppose between the moving blocks, the semi-solids, the paracoopers, and the mumsies, this level is weirdly an amalgamation of several of the original game's levels that use this toxic ruins theme. I definitely did struggle to incorporate the mumsies into some of the level sections. They are a bit of an unwieldy enemy type, but I think they appear frequently enough to where their inclusion is never super jarring. The same also goes for the paracoopers, because I didn't just want to repeat the same setup of them being stuck jumping on a pump platform between two walls over and over again, so I ended up only putting a few of them in the level. One of the biggest challenges for me whilst designing this level was dealing with its structure. As usual, I'd come up with a bunch of setups and secrets and whatever ahead of time, so I vaguely knew what I wanted to put into the level, but with what I had planned, putting just a single checkpoint into the level just wasn't going to cut it. I had an idea for an elaborate and difficult bonus room for the second purple 10 coin, so ideally there should be a checkpoint right after that to ensure the players won't potentially manage to beat that only to have to redo the entire bonus room if they die. However, I also had so many ideas for the section of the level preceding that bonus room that these couldn't all be crammed into the level's first half. So I ended up settling on a solution which the original game also resorted to quite frequently, which was to use not one, but two checkpoints. This meant the level could nicely be divided into 3 sections, which were each roughly the same size and each featured one of the purple 10 coins. I actually believe this is the biggest level I've made yet, although you do go through certain sections quite quickly, but still I do think that justifies using 2 checkpoints. In fact, considering most of my levels are way longer and more difficult than the original game's levels, I'll probably go back and add an extra checkpoint to some of my previous levels at some point before releasing them. This big vertical section is one of those ideas I'd come up with well in advance of starting work on the level. As I've mentioned a few times in previous videos, I've been wanting to make a fully vertical wonder level at some point, and instead I just keep adding smaller vertical sections to my otherwise horizontal levels. The temptation to break up the monotony of consistent horizontal progression in my levels is just too hard to resist sometimes, and in this case I am really happy with how this section turned out. I was afraid that the camera would be rather annoying when riding a platform up through a section like this. Being able to see what's up ahead is pretty crucial. But I managed to find a camera area setting that I hadn't used before that actually worked perfectly for this section. The problem with setups like these, where you're using the same platform throughout one long area, is that it could be pretty easy to leave the platform behind and sort of get stuck. Pump platforms slowly move back along the track if you don't stand on them, which means the platforms basically abandon you if you're not careful. However, in this particular section, that's not really an issue because the platform moves back down in a straight line, so you could technically always jump down after it. Of course, you might take damage from the burners in the process, but that's your fault for abandoning the platform, I think. This is also why I didn't make it to where the player carries the same platform through from the earlier horizontal section, because that would make it to where the player would be truly stuck if the platform went all the way back. The main challenge of designing the bonus room for the second purple 10 coin was not making it super duper boring at first. So the idea for the section is that the player rides a platform made of blocks with burners on them that fall apart and start rotating as the section progresses, with the surprise of that sort of being the main hook of the setup. The problem with that idea is that it first requires a pretty mundane section where the player just rides some blocks and avoids burners. So I tried making this section as short as possible to put the focus on the rotating blocks part. It was around this time that I did run into a pretty big problem with the burners, by the way, because it seemed like the collision of the burners that turn on and off periodically is a bit broken. As far as I can tell, when a burner turns off, moves off screen, and then turns on again, it sometimes spawns the collision of the fire in the place where it was just before it went off screen, or something like that. Honestly, I'm not exactly sure how or why this happens, but basically I found that I sometimes randomly take damage in mid-air whenever a burner has just moved away from a certain location. And this is particularly evident in the bonus room for the second purple 10 coin. This may be an issue that I can fix in the future, and if not, I'll probably have to redesign a few specific setups throughout the level, which really isn't a big deal. I decided it would be fun to start the last third of the level after the second checkpoint in the same way the level as a whole starts, by activating a bunch of blocks to make them move with a Wonder Bud. However, in this case, the blocks sink into the toxic goo, meaning the player has to time a jump to get onto another block that's just moved out of the way. It's a fun little setup, I think. I could have theoretically attached this part of the level to the previous part instead of putting it in a separate area, but I wanted to continue having the toxic goo at the bottom of the screen, which couldn't have been done very smoothly without transitioning to a different area. Honestly, as much as I'd come up with cool setups and ideas for this level, it was around this point that I was sort of running out of motivation. When making a level as long and complicated as this one, it can be hard to make the 10th or 20th setup using the same mechanics and not feel like you're just wasting the player's time. Of course, ideally each setup builds on the last, and the same idea is never repeated in exactly the same way, but still, I was starting to feel like what I was coming up with wasn't very interesting. Now, in hindsight, I don't really think that was the case. Reintroducing the level's mechanics with some simple setups after a checkpoint is a staple of my level design structure. Anyways, I did still have one more ace up my sleeve before the Wonder Effect section, which was the idea of this giant vertical section made of moving blocks that sink down into the toxic goo. This is actually an idea based off of an ancient custom New Super Mario Bros. U level that I made like 7 years ago, so it felt good finally using it in a level I actually liked. This section is also one of the reasons why I was so adamant on sticking to the whole blocks glowing when they move mechanic, because I really like the visual of the blocks all unexpectedly lighting up once the tower starts sinking into the toxic goo. Making a section like this is definitely a bit of a tough balancing act between making sure the player has enough stuff to do as to not get bored, without things getting too difficult to react to in a short time. For example, I originally intended on using way more burners throughout this section, but this is where the fact that I can't control the cycle of the burners turning on and off really came back to bite me. Because there was no way for me to guarantee that in a section where the burners need to turn off in order for the player to progress, this would actually line up with the timing of the tower falling down. So I ended up making it to where all the burners in this section don't affect the player's ability to progress through the section, and are instead basically just decorative. This means that, apart from the one mumsy, there isn't much to this section except for some basic platforming, but I think the threat of the entire level sinking down makes it decently interesting regardless. This section was another one where the fact that I had to tie each individual stone block to a separate rail was kind of a nightmare to work around. Calculating exactly how far each block had to go down was also a whole process. You'd be surprised by how much maths is involved with something as simple as making custom Mario levels. I remember telling myself when I started working on this level that I wasn't going to rely on moving lava or poison water in this case once again, because I've done that in so many of my levels in the past few months. So it's funny how with this section I technically managed to stick to that rule while still making a setup that was functionally identical to one that uses rising toxic goo. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if some people watching or even playing this level won't understand that this is not a random vertical autoscroller with rising goo, but that the camera actually doesn't move throughout this entire section. Alright, so as for the wonder effect, I decided to use the Shadow Mario clone thing, or whatever it's called. This is one of those wonder effects that I don't think you can really foreshadow using a level's mechanics unless you use the rift things from that one level in the original game, but even then the connection is kind of arbitrary. So therefore I don't think it's a problem that the Shadow Marios in this level's wonder effect don't really have anything to do with the preceding level's mechanics and setups. Thematically, I think it sort of works, since this wonder effect was also used in the same world as this theme in the original game. And in terms of design, they work very well with mechanics that force the player to wait around for a few seconds every now and then. The thing about the Shadow Mario clones isn't that you have to keep running to stay away from them, it's just that you can't stand completely still for more than a few seconds. So when I noticed that that was exactly what I was doing to wait for some of the earlier setups in the level, I realized that this would be the perfect wonder effect for the level. Of course, it is also kind of fun how I managed to include not just one, but 3 Shadow Mario clones, which is something the original game fully supports, but just never does for some reason. The game also allows you to determine the distance at which the clones move from the player, meaning I could line them up exactly how I wanted. On the other hand, the cutscene for the shadow clone spawning in is so hard-coded that it zooms into the same level coordinates where the clones would have spawned in the level they appear in the original game, which obviously doesn't line up with where they spawn in my level. So I ended up having to use a different type of cutscene, the one where the player sort of fumbles around and then looks left, which is normally used for wonder effects like the giant snowball one. It doesn't work perfectly with the way the shadow clones spawn in, but I think it's a decent compromise. The original game features 2 shadow clone wonder effect sections, one where you simply run through a very short part of a normal level area, and one that takes place in this big arena basically, where you have to collect tokens. I decided the former type would be more fitting for my level, since this meant I could basically make the section one big frantic chase using many of the types of setups that the level had introduced so far. So there's sections where the pump platforms dip into the toxic goo, sections where stone blocks with burners attached to them can be moved out of the way using wonder buds, and sections that combine all of those ideas at once. It was difficult balancing the difficulty of this wonder effect area because these setups needed to be fun and exciting to play through, but also not so complicated that they were impossible to deal with whilst all these clones were chasing you. So in the end, many of the setups here wouldn't normally be super thrilling, but make for a fun challenge with the added tension of the wonder effect chase stuff. I also decided to incorporate the third purple tank coin into this section, since I'd come up with a setup that would make the coin quite difficult to get, whilst at the same time allowing the player to do so quite quickly, which was perfect for a wonder effect like this, and could also be achieved more easily if you don't have the wonder effect activated. Of course, the natural thing to do towards the end of a level like this is to make some kind of payoff to each of the different mechanics the level has introduced. So that's what made me come up with the section with all the moving stone blocks. As opposed to some of the earlier sections along these lines, in this area the blocks each move in a different direction, making it quite a puzzle to deal with, especially if you also have the shadow clones chasing you. My original plan for the final part of the wonder effect section was to make this giant elaborate setup that involved a pump platform moving around 2 big rooms with rotating burners. However, if you've already seen the finished level, you'll know that this section didn't end up making it into the final thing, though I decided to keep it in the timelapse regardless. Me coming up with and setting up an idea like this in a level before eventually scrapping the whole thing doesn't happen super often. I probably don't test my ideas out ahead of time nearly as much as I should, meaning I usually just base my assessment of whether the idea will work or not on my pre-existing knowledge of the game's mechanics. But in this case, that knowledge fell short, because I just didn't think this section through enough. There wasn't one simple thing that made me give up on the whole idea, instead there were several smaller things that I maybe could have each solved individually, but together added up to me not really wanting to bother trying in the end. The camera was finicky, the whole moving burner collision thing was still a problem, the section was kind of needlessly difficult, and most of all it just wasn't very fun. So after working on it for like 2 hours, I scrapped the whole thing and decided to make a different final setup using the pump platform instead. I do think this lack of a truly impressive final section does sort of contribute to this feeling I have about this Wonder Effects section, which is that it isn't like super impressive or memorable. The vertical tower dropping into the toxic goo just before it is arguably more impressive, even though I don't think that could have been a Wonder Effects section on its own. Still, I don't think every level needs to have an incredibly memorable and bombastic Wonder Effects section, and from a mechanical standpoint, I don't think this level section is a waste either. It's just not super custom or very different from the rest of the level, but I think that's fine. Decorating the level was quite a task in this case, because most of the Toxic Ruins levels feature these massive background walls and pillars that I also decided to add to my level. I was surprised to learn just how simply these are set up though. There's only a couple of types of pillar and wall objects that can be connected in one or two ways, and that's basically it. Some levels in the original game feature these walls throughout almost the entire thing, but that just doesn't make for a very interesting or varied background, I think, so I made it to where roughly half of my level features background walls. Apart from that, a lot of the decorative elements from the Ruins theme use green goo or that kind of stuff, which I don't think fits this level because none of the mechanics are particularly gooey. Anyways, so now that the level is finished, let's go check it out in-game. Okay, and here we are. I can imagine it can be a bit frustrating for first-time players to immediately have to wait for a couple of seconds right at the start here with these moving blocks, but it is also just a nice way of, like, forcing the player to understand the main mechanic by having all these blocks move, and then only having the wall move away later, so you sort of have to look at that stuff, and there is also the nice coin secret over there. Here you can see something that happens sometimes, which is that the cycles of the burners and the blocks just don't really line up in a nice way. You kind of have to wait for both individually, and that can be a bit frustrating once again, but there's really just nothing I can do about that. And yeah, just waiting around for a couple of seconds here and there is just sort of a part of this level inherently, and I don't think that's too big of a deal, but I can imagine it can be a bit annoying maybe. The loop of the track there, that's just like a weird thing you can do in Wonder with tracks, which is very different from how tracks worked in like Super Mario World or New Super Mario Bros. U or whatever, where like tracks can overlap and do a little like path across itself, which is just, yeah, strange. But it's how pump platforms were used in the original game, and it is a nice way of sort of stopping the platform temporarily, which allowed for that section with the Wonder Bud earlier. But here we can kill the Mumsy to get onto this platform, and now we can move over to the right here, and we can go to where the first purple 10 coin is, so I'm actually going to wait a cycle. This section can be a bit difficult with the wall jumping and stuff. I also really like the way that Semi-Solid moves with the third block there. That's just like, it's sort of an unexpected visual, and I think it looks pretty cool. And I'm just backtracking here to show this coin secret, which I don't imagine most people will do, but I think that's it's kind of interesting. And here we have another power-up with the Bubble Flower, which is, yeah, this level's main power-up. I don't really, like, there's really nothing in this level that, like, requires the bubble, or that's really designed around the bubble. Also, rip that purple coin. It just felt like the right power-up for this level, because you can also, for example, attack the Mumsies with the bubble, so that just sort of felt like the right thing to include in this level. Here you have to run to avoid the poison water, or the toxic goo, or whatever you want to call it. And yeah, I like this section with the pump platform here as well, with the burner that moves up and down, sort of combining all of the mechanics right there, which is a logical thing to do right before the checkpoint flag here. And also that talking flower earlier is sort of there to have the player like look at something while they wait for the cycles of the blocks there to line up. These loop-the-loop pump platforms here, the way they move back on the track like that is kind of strange. Also, okay, thank you, Pyre Cooper. Yeah, because they move back in a circle forever, which isn't normally like how pump platforms work, because normally they just move back to the start of the track, but because those platforms go in a loop, they just keep moving forever and ever if you don't jump on them, which is a bit strange, but it does actually make sense when you think about it. Also, in this section, you can actually just like duck under this whole thing, which I think is like sort of a nice like way of allowing the player to sort of skip that stuff if they don't want to wait for the cycles, I suppose. And yeah, that talking flower there said "Tada!" And the funny thing is that later we have another talking flower that says "Tada! The sequel," which is just like a nice nice sort of like cohesive way of tying everything together in this section. But if you don't get that first secret, the second talking flower won't say tada the sequel, he'll just say tada. So that's just like sort of a nice little trick I did with the talking flowers there. And speaking of which, he's gonna say it right now. There we go. But if I hadn't gotten the earlier secret, that wouldn't have happened. Also, I do really like this vertical section. It worked out pretty nicely. I suppose we can get the Wonder Bud with the bubble there. And here we go. Here's the only bonus room in this level, which is sort of abnormal for how I normally design levels, but in this case, just it felt like with how long the normal level section already was and with how long this one bonus room was, I decided I wouldn't have more than one bonus room, and I think that worked out. I can imagine it can be a bit frustrating or like potentially unexpected that those blocks drop down like that, but I think there's just enough time for people to react to it, hopefully, and if not, then well, there's a checkpoint relatively like close to here as well, and yeah, there we go. A pretty fun little section. It can be quite difficult as well, I think, but I think it's manageable, and I really like the way the blocks line up there. Alright, so now for the last checkpoint. So yeah, we have 3 checkpoints in this level, or no, we have 2 checkpoints in this level, but we have 3 main sections with each of the 3 purple 10 coins. And that's something that I've sort of avoided doing in most of my levels so far, but it just felt right for how expansive this level happens to be. And here's something weird where you have to ride this platform by just standing still on it, because otherwise the pump platform will move back up. And that's just sort of an interesting way of putting a twist on the main mechanic there, as a nice, like, yeah, sort of interesting thing to do with the platform after so many sections with it moving normally. And here we have this epic section with the whole the tower falling down into the toxic goo. We can also move that mumsy away with the bubbles, though it actually does line up to where you can normally also just move along there with the mumsy walking cycle. Those blocks there just have coins, because why not? And then here we have another mini Wonder Bud, or whatever it's called, which allows us to get some more coins. And yeah, that also just felt like the appropriate talking flower voice line for this whole section. And there really isn't too much to that section in terms of like mechanics or anything. It's just kind of a cool like spectacle, which I guess is normally the job of the wonder effect. But like I talked about during the time lapse, I feel like maybe this particular wonder effect isn't really much of a spectacle, but whatever. You can see here that the cutscene doesn't really like make sense, because the Shadow Mario clones don't really spawn in after the cutscene or until after the cutscene happens. Also, I'm very good at the game, and yeah, it was kind of difficult for me to force the player to sort of like wait around and have the Shadow Mario clones catch up to you. But that's what some of the sections like that, or here where you sort of have to wait for the Wonder Bud to do stuff. That's what those are there for. To sort of force the player to yeah, to wait around and have the clones catch up to you. I can imagine this. Oh, I meant to. Let me see. I can imagine this third purple thing coordinate can be really chaotic and difficult to get. But it, you know, I've been able to manage with a bit of practice, so I can imagine maybe it can take players a couple of times to do that first try. But I think it's fine. And yeah, here we go. Some more stuff for the player to do. This section can be really chaotic, but it's also sort of the end of the section, so I think it's fine to have this really like difficult section right here. And then here we also have the finale of the pump platform and burner mechanic, which once again, this is just sort of here to force the player to like take their time, which can be really quite like tense with the Shadow Mario clones following you. But there we go, we managed. And yeah, there we go. That's the end of the Wonder Effect section. Now, normally I do show the non-wonder section at the end of these videos as well, but I don't really think that's like necessary in this case, because it's just the same thing without the Shadow Mario clones. So I think that's just going to do it for this video, guys. If you enjoyed, maybe consider leaving a like or subscribing or leaving a comment or whatever. I also have a Discord server linked in the description, and you can also sign up for channel memberships to get early access to my videos. But thank you so much for watching, and bye-bye!